Welcome to another episode of the Lessons from the Cockpit show, and I'm your host, Mark Hasara. For over 60 years, my passion has been aviation, and on today's show, we're going to have a guest on many of you have asked about. He's finally here, and it's an incredible story. This is the 68th episode of the Lessons from the Cockpit show. On the Lessons from the Cockpit show, we interview some of the most fascinating and intriguing pilots, aircrew members, maintainers, and aviation enthusiasts from all over the world. Our purpose is to hear their stories, but more importantly, what did they learn from these extreme and extraordinary military, commercial, and even general aviation air operations? Listening to their stories and exploring these lessons learned give us a greater understanding of how does the aviation world work and improves and increases critical thinking skills both in the air and on the ground. And today, folks, I know for sure this is a story that's not been told on any other podcast because the person I interviewed told me so. This, the 68th episode of the Lessons from the Cockpit show, is brought to you by Wall Pilot, custom aviation art for the walls of your home, office, or hangar. Go to wallpilot.com and look at over 130 ready-to-print profiles of famous aircraft from World War II all the way up to fifth-generation fighters. And folks, these are really detailed profiles. You can read the stenciling on the missiles and all over the airplane. We also do custom aviation art. We can put your name on your favorite airplane, the tail number, the unit markings, even the weapons load on the custom aviation art. These are 4, 6, and 8 foot profiles printed on vinyl that you can peel off and stick to the walls of your home, office, or hangar. We also do unit markings, and these we know are waterproof because a friend of mine has had them on his boat for a long time in Florida. Today we're interviewing Colonel Fred Izadseta, an Iranian F-4 pilot that flew during the Iran-Iraq War and has the distinction of flying one of the longest F-4 airstrikes in history. So, grab an adult beverage of your choice, sit down, strap in, and let's hear from Colonel Fred Izadseta, Iranian F-4 pilot. Welcome to the Lessons from the Cockpit show. We have a very honored guest on tonight, and that is Colonel Fred Izadseta, who is an Iranian F-4 pilot, flew F-86s and F-4s and a number of airplanes. And we're going to ask him some questions tonight. And he's going to tell us a lot about his background, but he has the distinction of flying a very, very unique mission during the Iran-Iraq War, which we'll talk about here in just a little bit. Colonel Fred, thank you for being on the Lessons from the Cockpit show tonight.
Thank you very much, myself. I really appreciate it. I'm very glad and very honored to be here.
Great, sir. And I think, first of all, tell us what it was like flying in the F-4 Phantom, because a lot of people are younger age, have seen Phantoms. What was it like when you flew the Phantom, Colonel, for the very first time?
Well, it is very, very, very hard. After a long time, it's kind of hard for me to be able to express my feelings. That was all I can tell you at this time. That was the most powerful and most incredible aircraft that I had flown in my entire career. What quarter of a century in the Air Force, which I served in the Iranian Air Force in about 25 years. And F-4 was nothing to be compared with what I had flown before, like F-86. We started with T-6. Actually, Harvard aircraft, that was for World War II war. Then after that, we went to the United States. Actually, I came here to the United States. We go under graduate pilot training course in U.S. Air Force. And we started with flying with T-37. And then after that, we got a chance to fly some T-33 T-Bird. Mm-hmm. And then after graduation from under training as a UPT, what they call it at that time, and I get a chance to go to fighter weapon school in Las Vegas, in Nellis Air Force Base at the time. And we started flying F-86 at that time. These are in early 1960s. Then after graduate, of course, from that fighter weapon school at the time, when we get back to Iran, starting flying, just continue on one of those squadrons, the F-86 squadron back in Wahdati Air Force Base, which was the second Air Force Base in Iran at the time. That was again in 1964, I believe. That was a long time ago. It's kind of hard to remember all the day. However, there was a bunch of experienced pilots, which were actually equivalent to the instructor pilot that we had in Nellis Air Force Base. I remember our squadron commander in Nellis was Colonel Fenton. I remember his name because he was kind of amazing instructor pilot.
Yes.
When I get back, with a bunch of fighter pilots from World War II that were in the Air Force at Nellis. But when I get back to Iran, the same procedure, the same system we were following in the Desful Air Force Base. Major Minu Seper was our squadron commander with a bunch of very qualified, very close to the same of instructor, the same of instruction training that we had in Nellis. And at the time, Colonel Minu Seper was flying in aerobatic team, Golden Crown aerobatic team in the Air Squadron. And it was different with the Thunderbird Squadron in Nellis. But that is how I saw ISR being under training for being an operation-ready pilot as a fighter pilot in that squadron. That was 2002 squadron, a fighter squadron in Desful. Then I get a chance to fly some F5 because that was the requirement in order to go to the F4. That was when the F4 was purchased by our country. And it came to our Air Force. We get a chance to be transferred from F-86 to F-4. However, there was a requirement to fly F-5 in order to go to the to F-4 training. Then I had to get a chance to fly some F-5 at the time in order just to be familiar with what they call it, a high-pitch attitude training at the time. Then after that, I was transferred to 11 Tactical Fighter Training Squadron as the F-4 pilot. At that time, we have F-4D was delivered to Iran. None of these aircraft, it was even close to characteristic and flying capability of the F-4s as far as the power of the engine, the capability of flying, high-pitched attitude, and responding a powerful engine like a 30, if I remember it right, each engine had about 17,000 pounds of thrust, which two of them is going to be about 34,000 pounds of thrust. That was amazing. It's kind of hard for me to be able to explain all the feeling that I have at the time and be able to compare the capability of all I can say, to my idea, or at least to my knowledge, up to this time, no aircraft was made like F-4. To me, that was something different. That is I really love him, and I really I missed that glorious day.
Oh, I can imagine, Colonel. And particularly, sir, 34,000 pounds of thrust. When you went into afterburner, I mean, you moved, didn't you?
Full afterburner, that was, if I remember it right, it was about 34,000 pounds of thrust.
Yes, sir. In burner. And
full afterburner, yes. And I personally have experienced 2.2 speed of that aircraft. That is, I personally experienced it.
And that's flat moving.
Yeah. Of course, when you're sitting in an aircraft, you don't feel it. But if you happen to fly close to something, then you can actually see the speed.
Yeah. And we're going to talk about that here in a little bit too. Now, you mentioned going through fighter weapons school in the F-86. I'm just curious, sir, what kind of syllabus did they have? Was it all air-to-air gunnery? Was it air-to-ground gunnery? Did you do some bombing also? Those kinds of things?
No, actually, not much of that. basically, as you know, F-86 had only a single cockpit. They didn't have any dual cockpit. In order to be able to fly that aircraft, our instructor, they were flying in different aircraft. They were chasing us. That is how they train us to be able to fly F-86 single cockpit aircraft.
Yes.
Because it didn't have any dual cockpit. In other words, the instructor could not fly in the same aircraft with us. That is a fighter weapon school. We get familiar with with everything a little bit, not up to the point of being operation ready pilot. That is what, when I get back to Iran at the time, as I told you, I went to the 202 squadron in their school. That is where what we call it continuation of training to be able to be operation ready, what we call it OR. And that sometime it took us about maybe 4 or 5 months. But in Nellis Air Force Base, it was, if I remember it right, it was about 4 or 5 months. Not even that, maybe about 3 or 4 months, just to be able to fly the F-86 as a fighter aircraft. That was the first fighter which I flew. But F-5 was different because F-5 had a dual cockpit.
But the F-86, it's an iconic airplane, particularly what it did in the Korean War. I mean, it's just one of those airplanes.
That is exactly what it was, yes.
That airplane during the Korean War and all the MiG kills it had and everything was just an amazing airplane.
Yes.
But so was the F-5, too. I mean, the F-5 was flown by many air forces around the world. If I understand what you're saying is, you flew the F-5 kind of what we called fighter lead-in, where they taught you all the fighter fundamentals of bombing and strafing and air-to-air, those kinds of things. Is that what you did in the F-5 before you went to the F-4?
Well, actually, I didn't get a chance to fly, or it was not requirement for me to be operation-ready pilot on the F-5 before I go to F-4. The requirement was only for me to get the feeling. Every pilot wants to go at that time to the F4. They have to have the feeling or the understanding of flying high pitch attitude, what they call it at the time.
Yes,
and that is the only thing that's the only reason. But then later on down the road, they actually took that requirement away. All the pilot, the rest of the pilot, we started that way. Then there were later on pilots from F-86. They were transferred to F-4 squadron without being able to be F-5. You know what I mean?
Yes, sir.
It was not a requirement, but at our time it was a requirement. In order to be transferred from F-86 to F-4, we have got to fly to have the feeling of the F-5 somehow.
Yes, sir. See, and I flew T-38s, which is, of course, the same airframe, same engines and everything. And God, what a wonderful jet that was. Yeah. A just fabulous jet to fly. I look back on my time in the T-38, sir, with incredible fondness. I went to Vance Air Force Base in Enid, Oklahoma, and got to fly the T-38. And oh my gosh, that was a great airplane to fly. And like you said, high angles of attack, going very fast, 350, 400 knots over the top. But I mean, it was just an incredible airplane to fly. And you flew the D models, and you also flew the E models, didn't you? The F4 with the gun in the nose.
I flew, I started with C model, and I flew D model. D, we didn't have any gun in the nose. It was like a gun pod.
Yes, sir.
Which was carrying on the pod underneath the wing. Then again, F4E, F4C and D, I get a chance to flew in United States for some kind of training. In Luke Air Force Base, I went through the IPIS, what they call it, instructor pilot training.
Yes, sir.
Back in early 70s, in order that was for night gunnery, night operation training, air refueling and night operation training. I went through that kind of training early in 1971, if I remember it right, back in Nellis Air Force Base.
Yes, sir.
And our squadron commander was Colonel Goody at the time. I remember he was a son of a gun pilot.
Was he?
Yeah, and then when back in Iran, then again when I started flying F-4E in Iran, that was phenomenal. That aircraft F-4E was I don't know, right? I cannot compare it to any other things.
No, and you certainly can't, because that was such an incredible airplane, and I've got to refuel them early in my career in the 80s, sir, and then again during Desert Storm, the F-4G Wild Weasel, the Sam Killers. I've got some great pictures of those things outside the cockpit. I always had my camera with me. It's just, the F-4 is just an incredible airplane, but just an iconic shape. The droop stabilizers and the upswept wings, and everybody recognizes an F-4. Oh yeah, I had my camera with me everywhere I went. So anyway, hey,
Colin, F-4 was, I would say, a stable platform in the air, and especially that was by the time I was transferred to F-4, I had some experience, about a little bit more than a year, chance to fly in Golden Crown team. No, you can imagine a stable platform, actually, like F-4, and having the experience of flying aerobatic team for a little bit more than a year. It wasn't that big deal for me to go for the air refueling. I didn't have any problem to go for that air refueling. I would say without any training, I was sitting in the front seat of the F-4E or F-4C in Luke Air Force Base with the instructor in the back. I didn't feel anything new. I was flying very good, very stable next to the KC-135 at night even. I didn't have any problem. I didn't feel anything new.
So when you're on the Golden Crown team, what airframe did you fly?
F-86.
They had F-86s. Okay.
Yes, sir.
So you went back to your old F-86 and got to fly air shows in the F-86. That must have been fun.
Yes, sir.
Hey, I want to ask you a personal question. How did you meet your wife? Where along this journey did you meet your wife?
Almost at the same time that I transferred to F4, that was the time I met my wife. It's about 50-something years ago.
If you don't mind me asking, sir, how did you meet her?
Well, I met her in one of my friend's house, unexpectedly. I was invited to a party, and he was we have a good friend. I'm still friend with that guy. He was a doctor, and he invited me, and we just all of a sudden it happened for me to meet my wife.
And here you are, a steely-eyed fighter pilot. How could she possibly turn you down, huh?
Actually, that was the longest story. I don't want to get in that part of that.
I know. We won't get into that. I met my wife the same way.
That is a different feeling.
Yes.
I cannot explain it. It was I'm really glad, and I really appreciate whatever happened at that night. And very easily, I'm talking about half a century ago, yes, about that moment. It makes me excited, and I cannot express my feeling at that. And I'm still in the same situation.
Oh, that's great to hear.
I'm one of those happy.
I met my wife at a party I didn't want to go to. I stood her up on our first date, and our courtship involved nuclear weapons. I was on nuclear alert every third week.
Oh, yeah.
And it was the same way. I met her and asked her to marry me 8 weeks later, sir.
No, after I met my wife, it took about maybe a couple of years before we get married. And every moment of it, I really remember it, but it's kind of hard for me to express my feeling.
Yes, sir.
About half a century ago.
I was going to ask you about your planning experiences, particularly in the 80s, you're now flying F-4s in the Iranian Air Force. And of course, you go to war with Iraq, and it's a long war because I think it lasts almost a decade, doesn't it?
8 years.
8 years. Wow. And so now you have become a combat pilot, and you're also one of the instructors and high time Phantom flyers in the Iranian Air Force. Maybe you can talk to us a little bit about the different missions that you did in your F-4 during that time period.
That part, Colonel, is a little bit hard to explain because of the political situation. I'm talking about the time that war started.
Yes, sir.
It started very unexpectedly. We were not even thinking about getting involved with the war with Iraq. We were not considered them to be that big an enemy to face us at the time. And all of a sudden, we face ourselves being in the war with the country we never count on them. You know what I mean? And it just happened like that. And unfortunately, the situation in our country was all of a sudden I find myself with the rank of colonel to be on the top of the Air Force. You mean the Air Force commander, he was one of my friends. All the staff of him, we were all colleagues, almost the same rank. Now you can imagine how you can start fighting with everybody on top at the same level, at the same experience, and without having knowledge of be able to went through the different training to be able as the commander of the Air Force. You know what I mean?
Yes,
or
sir.
like the chain of command, everything will disappear. Again, I don't want to get involved in that part of political situation, but
Yes, sir.
that is what we find ourselves in the position that we were not trained for that. You know what I'm talking about? In order to be able to be on the position of the command in the Air Force, like Colonel Jahanbani, Colonel Merman, at the time that was general. All those generals has to go through different type of training in order to be able to be in that position, like Air Command Staff College, War College, and so many different training. I was in the middle of that road by the time the war started. I was not even, actually for the short period of time, again, after the revolution, I became the commander of one of the fighter bases, which I was not trained for that position. I was deputy commander of operation of one of the Air Force bases back down in Boucher when the war started. Now you can imagine deputy operation commander of one base all of a sudden find himself in the planning group in the war. The war with the country, we were not expecting to have Mirage F1 Mirage, MiG-25.
Yes.
All of a sudden, we were not expecting to be fighting with MiG-25, which is flying 100,000 feet. The aircraft that we have in our Air Force at the time, it was F-14. And we were very fortunate to be able to get the F-14 flying at the time. And the F-14, we could get it high as 60,000 feet. And it has a Phoenix missile because firing to the certain point. Now we were facing to fight with MiG-25, for example, to fly 100,000 feet. Then at what time we had to fly F-4 like a B-52. You know what I'm talking about? They have all kind of bomber, like a Soho, like a, I don't know, any kind which is part of my, a scope of talk about what they had as far as different type of a military. Whatever they need, they gave it to him. But at the time, Saddam Hussein, he was fighting with us. He was well prepared. All the country, they support him. All the Arab country, all the, I don't know, Russia, French, they have all kind of weapons. Yeah. What we have lost all of commanding officer. We didn't have anybody, any general in the Air Force at that time. And none of us, myself, Colonel Fakouri, all the people that we were on the commanding position to run the war, we didn't have any experience to go through the fighter, commanding high command training.
Like Air War College and things like that.
Air War College, not even Air Command Staff College, because that was my next step before I become a general. I had to go through the different training, none of those. And all of a sudden we find ourselves fighting with F-1, Mirage F-1, which we never expected. And these are the positions, unfortunately, it happened, and it happened very fast. And in no time, they came and invade our country, and we were left in the middle of nowhere. And no country was concerning to give us any help. That is where we find ourselves, unfortunately. But I'm glad we were able to be handling. But we pay a lot for that war. But we did it. And it is all over the place. Now, everybody today that I'm talking to you, everybody knows that we did it.
And you did it very well, sir.
And we did it very well. And we are very proud of it. That is what I was trying to answer your question. Because of all those things and the political situation, I was not allowed to fly the aircraft with the weapon underneath it. You know what I'm talking about.
See, sir, and that's amazing because you're one of the most experienced pilots in your Air Force, and you're not allowed to fly combat, are you?
But they allow me just to sit in there and planning. That was why I had to fly at the command post. Mm-hmm. I took the 747 for the purpose of air refueling and using it as a command post. That is as far as they let me fly. I wish I had a chance to fly, but fortunately, I was one of those fortunate guys who get a chance. All my students were involved with that war, and they did it well. They well done.
And see, as a commander, sir, that's got to make you extremely proud to see all these guys that you trained personally step up to the plate and take on an enemy that you did not know was coming and do as well as you guys did. That must make you extremely proud as an instructor.
That's how I am. That's what I am. And I'm still flying. But when I'm flying, Cessna 182. And I'm still current. My physical current, I'm at the age of, I just passed the 80s. And I'm glad I'm still able to fly, and I do. And I'm very proud when I see any one of my students all over the place. And they are like a brilliant. They are still shiny all over the world. Yeah. Wherever they are still brilliant. They are shining all over the world.
Yes.
Like General Jahanbakhsh, General Barakool. When I hear their name, what could I get? I don't want anything more.
Yeah, I know. You get a lump in your throat.
I'm proud of all of them. I'm proud of every single person in the Air Force. We all did it together, hand in hand. We paid a lot, but we did it.
Yes, sir. Now, you mentioned flying in the 747. I'd like to talk about that very mission, okay? Because as far as I've been able to tell, sir, that's one of the longest F-4 airstrikes in history. And so let's talk about that for just a minute, okay? And that's the H-3 airfield strike that you guys did. Now, why H-3 airfield? Why did you need to go to H-3 airfield?
As I explained it thoroughly in the book, I think Fashi might be able to better explain it for me. That was the time we were facing. On the first couple of months, we did a lot of accident. They destroy a lot of pilots on the air, on the ground, fighting with the tank and all different things, which I explained each one of them individually in my book. But the problem was, there was a time then we sent a pilot for a strike mission. For example, is one of the closest base to the boundary of Iran and Iraq. They come on the report after mission report. When we're reviewing after mission report, there were no sign of any aircraft in any field. Majority of the aircraft was not on the flight line, on the border line. I'm talking about the fighter aircraft.
Yes, sir.
Then we came up to that was the question. We faced the question, what happened? Where are they going after the mission? They were flying at night, at high altitude, over the capital of our country. They were dropping bombs. And where did they go after that? We didn't have, not enough, I wouldn't say not any, but we didn't have enough information as far as being able to find out where are these aircraft are keeping. And all of a sudden, we find a report, there is a airport, there are some airport way back to the west border of Iraq. And after the mission, they come back and they go to that part. And then we find out there are everything they are supporting to Iraq. It was coming from some other country to the east, to the west of Iraq, and then transferring from there to the front line of our country, which was east of Iraq. Then we start thinking of planning to go and find the route of that. We find out there are a place, that's what they call it. I went further down and we find out those airports were used on Iraq against Israel war in June of
1967 war. Okay.
1967. That was the Air Force complex. It was down to the ground one time at that time on that war. And then we research a little bit more. Then we find out that is where they are keeping the aircraft after they're coming back from bombing our country. Instead of coming back, for example, to Shoaibia or Kut or any other places, they fly back to that part and they keep their aircraft in there and they do the service, everything. Then they brought him back to the frontline forward bases.
Oh.
Maybe I should be able to explain it more, but this is to start what we find out. After we find out that was true, then we start planning. We have to go there and bomb those bases, and we didn't have any other choice. Not a single choice. Mm-hmm. That was the only thing was left for us, and we had to go and bomb that bases. Then we figure out after the planning, long planning, we find out we have to pay very, very, very high costs for that. We were expecting to lose half of our power by doing this mission. And believe it or not, all the pilots come volunteer. They step forward and they encourage us. Let's do it.
Let's go.
Everybody.
Because they knew the price too. They knew that they had to go there, sir.
They paid the price. We lost about 300 pilots in that war. And that was a lot for the country. We only have 1,000 pilots. And we lost 1/3 of our pilots. And they paid it.
Now, if I remember right too, sir, the H-3 complex that you went to, that you planned this mission to, that's where Saddam was hiding some bombers, I think, that he just had recently acquired. Is that also true?
They had all kind of aircraft there. They were assembling all kind of helicopters there. They were assembling, after we find out, they had assembling 500 helicopters there. 500? 500 helicopters. That was on the report that we, intelligence report that we received. And assume if we give them a chance, to bring that 500 helicopter to the front line, then what would happen to our country? And then again, as we think about it more, it becomes more impossible mission to us. But again, as we thought about it more, we didn't have any other choice. We had to do it, but we didn't have any bomber aircraft. That was the time we used F-4 like a B-52 to do the carpet bombing. As you know, the F-4 for the bombing, it has to be on some kind of dive angle, like a 45-degree angle to be the best, to get the best out of it. It has to be on 45-degree angle. But the site itself, to aim the bomb, it doesn't depress more than 245 mil depression.
Yes, sir.
Now, what we do? You had to go straight on level at 40,000 feet, bomb and refuel the aircraft with 8,000-pound bomb about 100 feet above the ground, go do the bombing, and then come back, air refuel, and then come back. 4 times refueling for the fighter pilot to sit inside the aircraft for 4 or 5 hours. What country, what statistic you have about this? Which country did it?
That's what I'm saying, sir. As far as I know, this is the longest F-4 airstrike that I've been able to find, sir. And
even though if you think it right now, it is impossible. But we did it. Yes. When I was going and visiting, they asked me to go and visit for the same purpose. Boeing manufacturing in Long Beach. I went, I met the people that were building that aircraft. They said, how did you fly this aircraft for 300 feet above the ground? It is not built for that. Because the ground effect, it has to be the same length of the wing. The wingspan of this aircraft is 200 feet. I'm talking about 747.
Yeah.
And the minimum altitude for that flight to be able to be used for the refueling, it is 22,000 feet. And they asked me in the Boeing factory, how did you fly that? According to what dash one? According what procedure?
All the pilot manuals say, don't do this, don't do this.
We wrote the procedure ourselves. We took the Boeing, which is not supposed to fly by the book, below 22,000 feet. We took it about 300 feet above the ground. And on top of that, there was 8 aircraft that were going to get the refuel from this aircraft with about 16,000 pounds of ammunition underneath it. Now, combine this ground effect together for the F-4 with 16,000-pound bomb underneath it, and that pilot, we didn't allow them to talk to the boom operator. Because if they're going to talk to the boom operator, the position, their position on the scope of the radar, of the enemy radar, was pop up. Nobody was allowed to talk. Nobody was allowed to press the microphone button. And as soon as, without any direct from the boom operator, they had to fly about a couple of, I don't know, I would say a couple of 10 feet underneath the aircraft, which under the ground effect and the wing wash of the Boeing 747, they have to fly that aircraft with 16,000 pounds of ammunition underneath that, 100 feet above the ground. And I was sitting as a commander on the cockpit of that Boeing 747. And I had to direct whatever I was seeing without being able to talk to them. I had to give my instruction to the radar, the ground radar on Tabriz, with another aircraft with our C-130, and then through the HF, and that's a long story. And but our pilots did it. And every single of those pilots, the 16 pilots on that aircraft, they were volunteers. And that is what I'm talking about, the Air Force family. That's what I mean. My wife didn't know what I was doing. At that time, I had 2 daughters. They were the age of 6 and 7 years old. Nobody knows that. They don't. My wife, she was only, I don't know, maybe 24, 25 years old. And she didn't know where am I. I didn't have to, I couldn't tell her. This is the situation that we fight.
So, Colonel, did you go?
Good.
You did. So, Colonel, did you go back to the boom pod to watch the air refueling? Because when you're at that altitude, F4, you do it at 315, 320 knots. So you were moving across the ground. You were doing what?
By the time I get down, as you see, the boom operator, they start giving the fuel when they are sitting on they're sleeping on their stomach. They are actually lying down on their stomach, and they give the fuel to the aircraft, right? When I went there to see what they are doing, I was scared the hell out of me, because the ground was passing underneath.
At 400 knots?
At 400 knots refueling, 300 feet above the ground, and this guy, they weren't able to talk to anybody to get the instruction. You know how air refueling is.
Yes, sir.
You have to put the aircraft in the exact envelope in order to boom operator to be able to give the fuel without talking to the boom operator. You are the tanker pilot, and you know what I'm talking about.
Particularly, sir, in the F4, because it's got that little pop-up door. It's got that little
back
behind you, about 12 feet behind you. You've got that little pop-up receptacle. Okay.
Exactly.
And literally, it's just this little small door that pops up on the F4. And to be doing that at 400 knots at 300 to 200 feet, sir, with all of the ground effect and bouncing around, because, sir, your mission took you through the mountains of Turkey and then around Syria. Is that correct?
Exactly.
And so you're flying through having flown over the Silosat Mountains in southeastern Turkey, I've seen these mountains. These are large mountains. And of course, Mount Ararat is just up, a couple hundred miles. We'd see it every time we'd make a turn. And in order to go through those mountains at 300 feet, that's an incredible flying feat, sir.
And some of those mountains, they still have snow on top of those. Now you assume the wing wash of the 747. How great is the wing wash? The wingtip vortices on the aircraft is flying about 400 knots, 300 feet above the ground, with 200 feet of wing span. With the aircraft, the length of the aircraft is about 200 feet. Assume what is the wingtip vortices underneath this aircraft.
Oh, yeah.
That is impossible. When I'm talking about the flying, I was sitting on that aircraft and I was watching the pilot, what he was doing. That pilot is still alive. I can bring him sometime and sit him in front of you in this.
Is that the guy that lives in Toronto?
No, the guy is Kamran Etemadi. He's still alive and he's in Canada.
Okay.
He's one of those heroes. Assume this aircraft, he was flying this aircraft with the rank of captain. At that time, he was a captain. He was a young captain.
Yes, sir.
And he was flying Boeing 747, 400 knots, 300 feet above the ground. When I was talking about this, that I'm talking to you right now, nobody was believing me in Boeing factory. The plant of the factory.
I can imagine.
They didn't believe it. They didn't know. They said, no, this is a joke. But that was not a joke. Now that I'm sitting right in front of you, and I can bring the pilot, the Boeing 747 pilot, and sit him right in front of you. That's what we did it. That's our Air Force did it. I didn't do it alone. He didn't do it alone. We did it together.
Yes, sir. And if I remember right, the 747s were in Damascus. They came out of Damascus. Is that correct?
Use the basket for the F-14.
Oh, okay. Got it. No, I'm saying...
a boom. It's a telescopic boom for the F-4, and they are using the basket for the F-14.
Okay.
That is another longer story. F-14 of using the basket at night. That is one thing we did it in this war.
And, sir, I know what that's like, too. The KC-135 and refueling F-14s at night. But what I was saying was, if I remember hearing the story correctly and reading it in your book, the 747s or one of the tankers was actually in Damascus and met up with the group as they were refueling. Is that correct?
That was another political situation.
Oh,
We were two of them because I didn't want to take that big risk with one tanker and bring 8 aircraft if I couldn't be able for any reason. One aircraft was not enough. I have to have some reserve for that, some support for that. That is why we were 2 aircraft in the mass. And let's not talk about that.
Okay, we won't talk about that. And folks, you've got to go read this story in his book. His book is The Immortals of the Sky, and I got mine on Amazon. Okay, and folks, you have to go read about this mission because in his book he describes all of the things that he's talking about, and it is incredible. Okay, the KC-135 was not allowed to do what he's talking about. We were told by Boeing that the warranty on the KC-135 airframe would be null and void if we started doing low altitude refueling with fighters like you're talking about. We were doing it at 3,000 feet. You guys were doing it at 300 feet. And again, just an amazing mission. Now, of course, you get to the H3 complex, sir, and you show up and you surprised everybody, didn't you? And it was a very successful bombing mission, correct?
You better believe it. You better believe it. We didn't get along. We didn't get a chance to anybody to be able to escape. That was a surprise attack. Not even after the fact, when I hear it on the radio, they were talking about, nobody was believing. And they were thinking of, I don't know, somebody else from some other, I don't know, maybe some alien. So the Iraqis are like going, who are these people that just showed up over our base? And you guys are dropping a lot of bombs off of these F4s. And I'm sure you're probably shooting the gun too, aren't you? Thousands and thousands of the bombs. That is another phenomenon which we did with the F4. Flying 40,000 pounds, 8 tons of ammunition underneath and dropping the bomb from 40,000 altitude at night. That is one thing we did with the F4. Okay. Nobody was believing it, but we had to do it, and we did it. Wow, 40,000 feet. That's incredible. The pilots are alive. They probably can hear me right now. I don't know. And sir, you're not using precision guided weapons, are you? You're using like Mark 82s or 750-pound bombs, exactly, with nothing on them to make them precise. You're just, you're really, using your bombing computers and everything that you have in the airplane, obviously, but it's nothing like what we have now. You're dropping, basically what we call gravity drop dumb bombs, aren't you? That's actually what we did. By timing, we didn't have any sight. That is another story, how we did it. But we did it, and everybody knows that. And all the pilots are the witness. So, sir, you came in at 300 feet. I'm assuming that the F4s popped up and dropped their bombs and did their things. And, of course, you've got the gun, too. So, I would think if I was an F4 pilot, sir, I would go there and I would literally clean the airplane off of all my bombs, shoot all my bullets, and go home. That's exactly what we did. We were not using any extra gun pod on the pylon on the aircraft. We were using the pylon only for, there was no external fuel. We were flying F4 with the full internal fuel. That is why we had to refuel 4 times. Okay. In order to get to the target. So you had no external wing tanks. You were carrying bombs literally on every pylon to include the centerline pylon. Exactly. The only gun we have, it was a nose gun, which is in the F4E. Yeah. And F4D, we were not using it at war time. And you flew a mix of Ds and Es on this particular sortie to H3. Is that correct? On this particular, we didn't use any F4Ds. No, only F4E. Okay, because they had the better engines, obviously, too. It was more dependable, more newer aircraft, and we didn't want the weapon we have the malfunction when we get to the target. We didn't want to, in order to release the bomb, we face malfunction because F4D was an older aircraft. We were using it for the closer support. It was very hard. The most part of it was for us was to get to the target. The target thousands of miles away. Yes. with just guys sitting in an aircraft and flying in a hardest possible environment, which is, I would say, impossible environment.
Well, and the sun's beating down on you. You're flying through turbulence, not just the turbulence behind the 747, but I'm talking about turbulence from the mountains that you're flying through.
Exactly.
Particularly mountains that have snow on them. And
mountains had the snow on them. The time was on the sunrise when the ground start heating up.
Yes.
The snow start melting and the air mass was start raising up. And now we put the Boeing 747 in the ground effect with the wing wash. And now we have the aircraft, F4 aircraft with 16,000 pounds. And on all kind of this turbulence, you add them all together and you come up with a number, that number is impossible. And what we did is possible.
Colonel, you get home from a mission like that, and you probably couldn't even move out of the cockpit, because people don't understand, Colonel, how stressful that is mentally to fly something like that. Because that kind of a mission, there's a lot of mental preparedness that goes into it. And as we all know, no mission goes like you planned. Something always comes up during the mission that you go, oh, we didn't plan on this. Oh, we didn't plan on this. But you just go ahead and do it. But these kinds of missions, you're mentally exhausted when you get down on the ground, aren't you?
And let me ask you one question. Let me turn this question back to you.
Yes, sir.
I want you, I am a commander, and I ask you to do the mission, which is 80% lost. What do you tell me? Do you volunteer for this kind of mission?
You know what, sir?
Every single pilot in the Air Force, they were volunteer to do it. Can you assume this thing? What does it mean?
And they knew all the risks. They knew the risks.
All this information that I'm putting on the table, I'm telling him, this is the mission. If we do it, we have a chance to survive.
Yes.
But if we don't do it, we all die. And we better die. If we don't have any country, we better die.
Exactly. And
this
that's the thing.
Our culture. This is our history.
And see,
this
ours is the same.
History keep us alive.
Ours is the same, sir. Because, we would all volunteer to go and do it. Because we knew if we don't, then what becomes of us? I'll never forget the first combat mission I flew on the opening night of Desert Storm, refueling F4s, sir, Wild Weasels. I was scared out of my mind because I didn't know what to expect. And the Iraqi Air Force alerted on us and were flying toward us. Of course, we had F-15s and all kinds of things out in front of us, but, I didn't know what to expect. I didn't know. I wasn't trained for that kind of thing. Coming from Strategic Air Command and then flying at night, VFR war, flying the Wild Weasel, the first Wild Weasel package into Baghdad, nonetheless. So there's a lot of high visibility and pressure, but you just go and do it because this is what you've been tasked. Like you said, everybody volunteers and is lined up at your door. Put me in, coach. Put me in, coach. Hey, Colonel, I've got one other thing I wanted to ask you about. Yes, and that is during this war, there was a lot of theater ballistic missiles that you had to deal with. During the first Gulf War was the first time the American Air Force ever had to deal with a mobile theater ballistic missile threat. How did you and the Iranian Air Force deal with trying to find these Scud missiles?
To answer to this question of you, I would rather to get one of my F-14 pilots to answer this question.
Okay.
Because I don't want to say something which I was not practically involved myself.
Yes, sir.
I have a general. He's a good friend of mine. Actually, he used to be, at the time, my student. And he is alive, and I am very honored to be in contact with him. I would rather him to answer this kind of question.
Well, sir, I'd be happy to have that contact.
Information. That's what you're looking for, first-hand information.
Yeah, I'd love to have him on because you know what, sir? We used a lot of resources to try and go and find those things. And we were using Strike Eagles at the time because that was the best thing we had. That was because they had, of course, the Lantern targeting pods and so forth. But man, that was a tough mission. It was very stressful because Scud missiles were going into Israel. Scud missiles. Sir, I actually got to watch a Scud missile launch when I was up near the border of Iraq, refueling a bunch of F-15Cs. It was the most amazing thing, watching this thing lift off the ground and go up over our heads. And of course, we called in and says, "Hey, here comes one." And of course they go, "How do you know?" I says, "Because we're watching it go over the top of us." You know what, sir? We've talked about just about everything we had planned on talking about on this list. I mean, you've hit it all.
Thank you very much to give me this opportunity.
Sir, I'm glad I found you. I'm glad I spent the time to find you, because talking about this F-4 mission and you being like the mission commander in the 747, that's an incredible kind of thing, sir. It really is. And a lot of people don't know about this. I don't know any of Americans that do. Maybe some old head guys at Boeing do. But you just explained, sir, one of the things that goes into the mission planning and the execution, and again, your duty to your country. And you just say, yeah, we might not come back from this, but my children, my wife, my grandchildren will still be alive.
And we are all proud of what we did.
Yes, sir. And you should be proud. Okay? You should be proud.
Thank you.
Colonel Fred, thanks for being on the show today. And thank you for
giving me
spending the
the
time
opportunity.
with me.
I really appreciate to be here.
And I appreciate you spending the time with us tonight, okay? And being on the Lessons from the Cockpit show.
Thank you very much, sir.
I just want to add a couple of things to what Colonel Fred talked about here, and just kind of reminisce a little bit on some of the leadership items that he talked about in this show. I remember very vividly being told by the 99th Strategic Weapons Wing, Strategic Air Command's kind of tactics group, 10% of us weren't going to come home from the opening night of Desert Storm, or the first 3 nights. And the mission that I was given was very dicey. I was refueling the first Weasel package into Baghdad. We'd be one of the people that are like at the very tip of the spear. And I remember thinking to myself, holy smokes, I'm just a young captain in my early 30s. I'm not going to come home from this? And we're talking 10%. Colonel Fred and his group, 80% chance they're not coming back. And yet he had people lined up at his door saying, put me in, coach. I'm ready to go do this. I don't know how many times we have asked our American military, young men and young women, to go into harm's way with some really, really stretchy odds. And there was a line outside the door to do it. All of them volunteering. And, think about it, If you're married with kids, what do you tell your wife? Hey, sweetheart, I'm going on a mission tonight I can't tell you about, and the odds are not in our favor, so this may be our last kiss goodbye, but I love you. I'm off to go do what I've been trained to do, and you go do it. And that's the way it was with Colonel Fred's team. They're all just young captains. Did you hear him? Just young people lined up at his door to go off do something dangerous. Second item I thought about, I don't know how many times Boeing told us that if you do low-level air refueling with these KC-135s, we don't know what it's going to do to the airframe. And, there was rumors of, they're going to nullify the warranty, whatever. I have no idea when that warranty ran out, because we'd been flying the airplane for 30, 40 years already by Desert Storm. And sure enough, on the opening night of Desert Storm, we did have KC-135s doing a low-level air refueling mission, not at 400 knots, but at 315 with a whole train of F-15E Strike Eagles. And that mission was designed to be just under the radar so that the F-15Es were dropped off at the border. Now, I think a couple weeks prior to us actually doing this mission, this KC-135 formation was going to drag these 24 F-15E Strike Eagles at low level into Iraqi airspace on the opening night of the war. Not one tanker guy or tanker gal turned that mission down. Now, if I remember right, they came just short of the border in the plan. That does not mean that they did not take them across the border, and they may have. I'd have to go look in my Strike Eagle book to find out if they actually went across. But I know by night 2 of Desert Storm, all kinds of people were going across. And then, of course, in Operation Iraqi Freedom, we actually put airspace across the border in Iraqi airspace on night 4. There was a lot of murmurings about us doing that. You're going to get people killed. Figure out a way to force protect the tankers, which we did, but we still did the mission. And there was only 8 Iraqi airplanes that took off during the war. I was more concerned about us running into each other than I was about something shooting at us. But we still had some pretty incredible odds, or so we thought. Those of you that have listened to the Navy SEAL, Rob O'Neill, he says right out front in his talk that he gives, if you go look up his TED Talk, hey, I know we may not be coming home from this, but they were still going to go. It was a very important mission. We're going to go get bin Laden. We might not come back. And in fact, one of their stealth helicopters got sideways coming across the fence and crashed. But they still did it. That's the great thing about the military, folks. The great thing about not just our military, but the Iranian military, like Colonel Fred's talking about. Young captains, young NCOs. We're going to go do this. It's an important mission. Yeah, I may not come back from it. We used to say, we signed on the dotted line on a check that says we'll sacrifice our lives for our country. And you go out and do it. Now, tactics-wise, 300 feet at 400 knots behind a 747. Now, the boom is about 50 feet long. The extension, if I remember right, is 20 feet. So that's 70 feet. So that means the fighters were refueling at 230 feet at 400 knots. And of course, if you make a wrong stick move at 230 feet at 400 knots, you're going to be dead in less than seconds, maybe even nanoseconds, because you're moving across the ground at normally 8 miles a minute. That's what the fighter guys do all their flight planning at. We are going to travel at 8 miles a minute. John Boy Walton said we're using 8 miles a minute. That's our rule of thumb. And at 230 feet at 400 miles an hour, there is little room for air. But you're getting bumped around by the jet wash behind the airplane and in the snow-covered mountains. These are all the planning factors that we had to look at when we were doing missions over Iraq, over Afghanistan. And of course, weather played a big part in this. It gets bumpy. Any of you that have been on an airliner that has taken off out of Houston, Texas or Dallas, Texas during one of those monster Midwest thunderstorms know exactly what I'm talking about. I've been hit by lightning 3 times. I've had to fly around typhoons in the Pacific. But you go and do the mission because that's what you're tasked to do, and that's your job. My job is to put my body in harm's way. And if that means we have to use tactics that I am flying at 300 feet, 400 knots, so that no Iraqi or enemy radar will see me, then so be it. And there's still a line outside the door of people volunteering to go do this. Of course, Colonel Fred was proud of his guys. He trained all of these guys. These guys that went on this mission, young captains, maybe a major, maybe, he trained all of them. Of course, he's proud of them. You get back from a mission like that, and of course, the satisfaction level of doing something that important is through the roof. And you have something to really crow about. Those are just a few things I wanted to add to the things that Colonel Fred was talking about. What an amazing man. What an amazing career. And now he just is a contractor in a Western state. And I don't know if anybody around him knows who he is or what he's done in his life, he's probably like most military people. He doesn't talk about it much unless pressed about it like I did. There's one thing that I really want to do that I found out from the gentleman who helped write his book and Colonel Fred is his Iranian military buddies get together every once in a while and have this big Persian dinner. That's a dinner I would love to attend. To be able to sit around with these gentlemen and hear their stories and their lessons learned and enjoy a good Persian meal. I promise you, Colonel Fred, you invite me to the next one, I'll make the trip down. I'll drive down or fly down and enjoy a meal with you, because I'd love to talk to all of these gentlemen that did so much for the Iranian country under some really, really tough government and political and cultural situations because of what was going on during that time period where there was a regime change in Iran. All of you can go read about what happened when the Shah left and the Khomeini regime took over. There's plenty of books, even Wikipedia's got plenty about it. But that's the environment that Colonel Fred was having to deal with. And I didn't want to get into the political stuff, and I told him we're not going to get into that because I want to hear about the flying, not the geopolitical stuff. He touched on it just a little bit. But please, all of you, go get his book, The Immortals of the Sky. It's available on Amazon. It's in paperback. I've got my copy here behind me. And he talks about all of the things that he went through during this war. And of course, flying F-86s and flying with their Gold Crown aerobatic team. He had an amazing career, an amazing man, now in his 80s. So folks, please go out and get his book, Immortals of the Sky, found on Amazon. Folks, thanks for joining me on this 68th episode of the Lessons from the Cockpit Show with Colonel Fred Izadseta. What an amazing story, huh? This episode is brought to you by Wall Pilot, custom aviation art for the walls of your home, office, or hangar. These are incredibly detailed profile drawings of aircraft from World War II all the way up to 5th gen fighters that you can peel off and stick to the walls of your home, office, or hangar. We've done unit badges, which are on trucks and boats right now and are doing very well. One of my friends has had his AFSOC patches on his truck for over a year now, have not faded, nor have they come off, even though he washes his truck every 2 weeks. Go to wallpilot.com. There's over 130 ready-to-print profiles that you can pick from, or we can do a custom drawing for you of your favorite airplane. Put your name on it, the unit you want it from, tail number, even the weapons load by just going to wallpilot.com. Please go take a look at some of these, because that's how we finance the Lessons from the Cockpit Show. That's how we keep this show going. I have the distinct pleasure of being able to attend the Tailhook 2023 Symposium this week. I will be in Reno, Nevada, Wednesday through the weekend with all of my Navy buds, which is going to be great. I am so looking forward to this. I will be on a panel discussion on Friday afternoon with a bunch of the Air Wing commanders and myself, all talking about the Shock and Awe campaign, OIF. It's been 20 years now. I'm obviously going to discuss what happened for the air refueling portion of that, but I'm going to come home with a lot of great contacts, a lot of great people I know. It's kind of funny because everybody on the panel, I think out of like 16 or 18 people on this panel, I know more than half of them. Worked with them in Iraqi Freedom, worked with them when I was teaching at the KC-135 Weapons School. So I will have a lot of things to tell you when I come back next week. Folks, thanks for downloading and listening to this episode. This and previous episodes of the Lessons from the Cockpit Show can be found on my website at markhasara.com. So please go by there, download a few episodes if you're on a long trip. Next week, I'll have a lot to tell you from my visit with all of my Navy bros and sisters from Tailhook 23. Thanks again, folks. Talk to you next week.